Kitchen Riffin, we're back with Asian flavored pork belly. I was going to do this pork belly 3 different ways, but I ended up only getting a couple pounds. And so I'm going to do kind of a combination of 2 of my favorite pork belly recipes. One by Sorted Food, one of my favorite YouTube channels, and the other by Gordon Ramsay. So we're going to kind of mix those and maybe throw a little bit of our own flavor in. So first thing we've got to do is score and salt the fat top of this pork belly. So pork belly is going to have 2 sides. First is the meaty part. Second is that fat part. So that's the part we want up. So we're just going to make diagonal cuts across the pork belly. And you can see I'm doing them about maybe a little bit less than an inch apart. And you want it to cut pretty deep into that fat. And you'll notice the fat is thicker in certain parts. But as long as you're cutting in a little bit, you can see, just make sure you got some room for that salt to go. Like that. So now that we've got that scored nicely, you can see it's got those little cubes of fat that it creates. Take some salt and be pretty generous with this because it's, 2 pounds of meat. So sprinkle it over and then try to get it in those grains when you can. So pork belly is essentially fancy, thick bacon. But I think you get a super rich and complex flavor that you don't get in bacon by leaving it in its cubed form rather than cutting it into strips. And you want to do this first because we're going to want to give it at least a couple minutes for that salt to do its job and draw out that moisture. So now that we've got most of those nooks and crannies salted, we're going to set that aside. So we've got 2 onions, and we're just going to take the outer layer off of these. And we're just going to cut these maybe into about 1/8. We've got a Dutch oven. You could also use a roasting tray. We've coated that bottom with oil. And we're going to let that heat up for just a little bit before we go in with our onions. And these are just to form our bed. We've also got a handful of garlic cloves. I'm putting in a lot because I love garlic. You don't have to crush them or anything. You can just throw them right in. And we're just going to give these ingredients color. Most of their cooking is going to be done in the oven after we throw the pork belly on there. Last fresh ingredient we've got there is ginger. And I'm just chopping this up to let the juices come out of there. You don't need to peel it. Throw that in there. And basically what we're doing, we're putting a little color on these, and then we're going to put the braising liquid in there with the pork belly, and it is just going to infuse that pork belly with all these flavors. So we got garlic, onion, ginger. Last thing, some star anise or star anise. These are really good to have in the kitchen because they pretty much, like most whole spices, take forever to go bad. They don't really go bad. And they give it that kind of licoricey flavor. I'm not a fan of licorice, but when you pair it with the 5 spice that we're going to put on here, it's awesome. And then lastly, just like almost everything we make, just a drizzle of honey for a little sweetness. Sometimes you'll see brown sugar in there, and that's just going to give it a little bit of sweetness to go with a lot of those other flavors. So we've got our pork belly. we probably could have given this a little bit longer. If you can give it like an hour to let that salt sink in and draw out the moisture, all the better. I'm just going to brush a little bit of this off. We want to keep a lot of that salt in there, but brush some of the excess off. Kind of like you've just cured it. Essentially that's what we're doing, is we're quick curing the top. And then we're going to take our Chinese 5-spice, put that all over, and be pretty generous with this. I'm just going to take the sprinkle off. You want to coat it almost like it's brown sugar on a whatever you put brown sugar on. And Chinese 5-spice, if you don't know it, it's a really indescribable seasoning, but it's one that I absolutely love, and it's like none other. So we've got that totally coated in the 5-spice. We're going to just give that a little bit of a shake. Put a little bit more on there, just so that it's completely spiced up. And that's going to go into our Dutch oven, fat side up. And so you can see we've made a little bed with the onions. We're going to put a little bit of water just on the sides. So I'm actually going to move my pork belly. And this water is like the conduit for that flavor from the onions, from the anise, from all those things to go in there. So we're going to alternate between water and white wine. So white wine is just going to give it more flavor. And you don't want it to come up to the fat, but you want it to essentially get every other part of that. So I'm just pouring around that pork belly, alternating water and wine. And then we're going to bring this to a boil. We've got our oven preheated to 350. Whoop. So if you mess up like I just did, no fear. Just pat that dry. We'll respice that too. Cover up that moisture. See if we can get away with it. I think we can. And then we're just going to wait for this to come to a boil before we pop it into the 350 oven. So we've reached our boil. Once it's boiling, we're going to throw that into the center of a 350 degree oven. And all that's left to do now is to wait for 2.5 hours, and we're going to pull it out, and it's going to be a magical transformation. So as you can see, really not a ton of prep work, and that's the beauty of any braised meat, is that you get everything done, and then you go get on with your life. Come back 2.5 hours later, and dinner's ready. Olive oil, tablespoon of butter. Almost never use this tool as much as I should. It's a bench scraper. 1 layer of potatoes. Put some soy sauce on them. Sesame oil. Just cover them in sesame seeds. I think our pork belly is done. Check that out. If that's not one of the most beautiful things you've ever laid eyes on, then I don't know what is.
Oh, you got the really good one, you jerk. Oh, I was gonna cheers you. Oh. Oh, really good.
Well done, James.
Well done.
Sorry, Chef Jameso. That's really good.